6 decades after his death, India's first prime minister remains a subject of heated debates. He's either glorified and credited with all national achievements, or demonized and blamed for every ill that plagues India. In discussions about him, rhetoric is usually so loud that facts can't be heard. His critics fabricate outlandish lies to tarnish his reputation, while his defenders venerate him in a cult like manner. We believe what is needed and what he himself would have appreciated is an objective assessment of his deeds and his legacy. To this end, I am deeply honored to host a panel of highly eminent scholars who bring their varied views on Nehru, informed by their own research. We have with us Dr. Abhishek Manu Singhvi, who's the senior third term sitting member of parliament, eminent jurist, former chairperson of Parliamentary Standing Committee on Law, and former additional Solicitor General of India. He's the national spokesperson of Congress and well-known author and visible media personality. We have Dr. Tathagat Roy, who is the former governor of Tripura and Meghalaya, a prominent socio-political activist, author of several books, including the much acclaimed biography of Syama Prasad Mukherjee. We have Dr. Tripurdaman Singh, who's a historian and author. His recent book, 16 Stormy Days, which is based around the First Amendment of Indian Constitution, has drawn lots of attention in Indian media and political circles. He's a British Academy postdoctoral fellow at the Institute of Commonwealth Studies at University of London. We have Dr. Adil Hussain, who's the assistant professor of legal and political theory at Leiden University in the Netherlands. And his upcoming work, Nehru, The Debates That Defined India, has been co-authored with Dr. Tripurdaman Singh. His research focuses on the history of international law and Muslim political thought in India. Welcome all of you to Argumentative Indians. It's an honor to have you. So Nehru is a vast subject. To cover him in 60 minutes is beyond ambitious. So what I suggest we do is we try to address some of the most widespread criticisms of Nehru, chiefly among which is his role in the partition and handling of its aftermath. If I remember right, last year, Mr. Modi said something like that someone has had to become prime minister, so a line was drawn in India and the country was divided. Mr. Modi was not the first person saying this. He was simply voicing a widespread view in India. So it would be good to address that. After that, it will also be helpful to look at the four main pillars of Nehru's legacy, which are the democratic institutions of India, socialism, secularism, and the non-alignment policy, none of which are any longer considered as sacrosanct as they once used to be in India. So with that, I would like to invite Dr. Singhvi for his opening comments.
Thank you. Let me start by issuing a disclaimer. I feel intimidated in the presence of full-time academics. I juggle more than one profession, public life and law being very zealous claimants, along with some amount of press. And I lay no claim to research. I lay no claim to a continuous production of thoughts and ideas, which used to be the preserve of academics, as I was at one time, early years of my life. So it is very intimidating talking amongst full-time people who have research on their fingertips. Let me start by, and I'm being told that the format is that I speak for about 8 or 10 minutes, and then each person does that, and then we have discussion. So that's what I'm going to do. That's what I was told. With many foreign audiences in particular, but also with Indian audiences, I often start by saying that look at something which is so seemingly simplistic, elementary, I would say, but yet elemental. And the answer to that has some insight on the Nehru-Gandhi equation in India in the formative years after independence. And that is that roughly of the 30 odd, could be, 30 to 40 odd countries which emerged from the yoke of imperialism, between the 1930s and the 1960s. And as you know, many of them emerged from British, French, Belgian, Dutch, and several other forms of colonialism. And they were spread across various continents. I found it quite amazing that possibly India, barring one or two very, very small, inconsequential exceptions, was the only country which became and remains till today a vibrant democracy. The wrecks and ruins of constitutionalism litter the landscape, be it in South Asia, amongst our Southeast Asian neighbors, so-called prosperous Asian tigers, Australasia, Africa, South America, and yet this remarkable emergence of a country the size, the diversity, and the problems of India remaining out of those 30, 40 odd emerging countries as the only vibrant, pulsating democracy. And I asked myself the question, and I asked those audiences the question, what could be the reason for this? Now, according to me, I have no answer. It's a subject of good research by itself. One answer I give easily is, of course, good luck, sheer good luck. But delving a little deeper, I personally, and this is only a personal view, that we got the sequencing right. Whether we got the sequencing right because of good luck or other factors, I don't know. But by sequencing right, I mean that we got the eternal agitational politician, Gandhi, who, according to me, was the only person who could get us independence. And we got, in quick succession, Nehru, who, according to me, in those circumstances, could be the only person who could have preserved independence, democracy, and made India remain, above all, a democracy. I mean, for example, and I don't say it entirely in zest, if the sequencing was reversed, possibly Gandhi would have made a disastrous prime minister. And in all likelihood, Nehru could never get his independence. So we got the sequencing and the combination right, is my personal view. Of course, as an aside, it's a very interesting irony how two people, these two names I took, could be more polar opposites of each other than anyone else. Of course, Nehru venerated Gandhi, but one was very godly, and godliness was part of his persona. The other was close to being either an atheist or an agnostic, but at the least was indifferent to religion. One was focused on villages, Gram. The other was, of course, a so-called industrializer, the modern economy. One believed in the modern power of the state. The other was very skeptical and suspicious of the modern power of states. That, of course, is a different story. But this is the combination and the equation which I think India was fortunate, and some of our Southeast Asian neighbors were not. Well, some of the pillars which our friend Arora talked about just now. See, I entirely agree that demonizing or idolizing Nehru, both are completely wrong. He was not only a human being prone to fallibility, but he was, of course, a very faulty human being, as most of us are. Certainly not faultless. And I'd be the last person to demonize or idolize him, and I think both those schools of thought are wrong. Most important is to judge him contemporaneously, contextually, in the context of what India was, how it was emerging, and not retrospectively, because wisdom is always 20/20 by hindsight. I have no hesitation in saying that his conception, and certainly you can have debates about your conception. It may not be a correct conception. I believe in that, certainly. Many people may not. And I can see that some of the people on the panel here may not. But a conception of a secular, liberal, inclusive, pluralistic, somewhat left of center, progressive, scientific, forward-looking modern nation state is the typical Nehruvian conception, and he strove for it. He tried to design it in the Constitution of India. People forget that the Constitution of India was preceded by the Objectives Resolution, which bears the stamp of Nehru. Very much these words are used: secular, liberal, inclusive, slightly left of center. That kind of a conception was there. And ultimately, he got the Constituent Assembly, good, bad, or indifferent, with diverse views from the extreme left to the extreme right, to accept that conception in large parts of our Constitution. I think if we see him contextually, then these are truly pillars, four of them being what was mentioned in the beginning. Now, certainly, I don't think that NAM is as relevant today as it might have been then. But I do believe that there is great resonance and relevance of that concept or parts of it even today, and certainly much more then. So be it NAM, be it secularism, be it the fundamentals of democracy, be it institution building, be it the ISROs, the All India Institutes of Medical Science, the Planning Commission, the reorganization of states in 1956, large chunks of the Green Revolution basis, IITs, CSIR, Bhabha Atomic Research, and I could go on, and you could as well. This institution building owes itself to them, and that is no mean achievement. Secularism, for example, I mean, by itself, it can have many days seminar, certainly not this 5-10 minute intervention. But one of the nice things I like about that is the definition of Professor Rajiv Bhargar, formerly of Harvard University. He said, what did Lincoln mean when he used the word of the people, by the people, for the people? Very strange. He said, by the people I can understand somewhat, for the people I don't understand of the people. And then he gives the answer himself. He says, of the people was intended to convey a certain degree of co-ownership of democracy to each and every person in India. A portion of a undivided family's estate, which each person has a small co-parcellary right in. That is the essence of secularism. Now, for Nehru, in the context of the worst ravages, of the worst migrations of history mankind has ever known, to have striven for that, call it inclusiveness, call it a large-heartedness, magnanimity, I think it's quite amazing. And I don't mean Nehru at all. It's only because we're discussing Nehru that I'm using his name. I mean each and every member of our founding fathers, including the Constituent Assembly as a whole. For them to have seen the kind of death and destruction and the fissiparous tendencies, and yet even to think of designing a constitution like that. And if you read the Constituent Assembly debates, I think each of them deserve salutes to have even thought to struggle for that. I think, therefore, that people like Martin Luther King, who use the words, there must be some weight to people like this when they say, and I quote, in the struggles of mankind to rise to a true state of civilization, the towering figure of Nehru sits unseen, but felt at all council tables. There is, I think, his worst enemies should concede that he was a founder and a maker of modern India, warts and all, failings and all. He was one of the first who foreshadowed the concept well before even independence of universal franchise, of multi-party system, of adult suffrage, of fundamental rights, of a secular state, and so on and so forth. What I feel contributed most to our democracy was the capaciousness of the nature of Nehru's approach to democracy. I mean, one cannot imagine any South Asian leader, or for that matter, any of those leaders of those 30 to 40 countries which emerged from imperialism, to have had the kind of cordial and fairly interactive relationships with complete opponents, philosophically, ideologically, and politically. From the Shama Prasad Mukherjees, to the Hiren Mukherjee, to the H.V. Kamaths, to the A.K. Gopalans, to the Ashok Mehtas, and there's a whole pantheon of names. It is not the incident or what happened which typifies, but it's the magnanimity of his democratic approach to life, which I think typifies the incident with Vajpayee in the early 50s. I think it was 1954, when Vajpayee, in a derogatory sense, compared Nehru to Churchill to suggest that he is hungry for power and incompetent for the post. And a short while later, Nehru not only praised him fulsome manner, but prophesied in those famous words that this young lad would one day, in all probability, become the Prime Minister of India. Now, I think then there are many more incidents, the G.V. Mavalankar incident where Mavalankar reminded Nehru that the custom convention is that Nehru should come to the Speaker's chamber and not vice versa. Or for that matter, the 1937 incident where he pseudonymed himself Chanakya and criticized Nehru in a pseudonymed article. I think they all go to make a overall democratic spirit. And I think that was lacking, be it in the Liakats or the Jinnahs, be it in the African leaders who emerged out of imperialism, be it in the South American leaders who emerged out of imperialism. And that capaciousness is what marks out Nehru. Since I'm sure we'll have a discussion, let me end by touching on what I think is a red herring false equation, which is repeatedly now invoked, much more so now in the recent past than earlier, the Patel-Nehru false equation. It is true that they were disagreeing on many vital issues. It is true that they were in that sense competitors. But let me tell you that the personalities we are talking about, Nehru and Patel, were towering personalities. There was a large-heartedness in their differences. There was an acceptance in their disagreement. And I think that is something which I miss the most in contemporary times. And I'm not talking politics, I'm not talking governments. I'm talking as the Indian Republic has progressed, the narrowness of thought, opinion, interaction is something which has to be deprecated. After all, the difference between us and Bangladesh or Pakistan on our left and right, or even Sri Lanka for that matter, is that the two ladies cannot sit together in Central Hall at the same time and converse. The Zias and the Nawaz Sharifs cannot be in Pakistan Central Hall at the same time, perhaps. But to end and remind you, in 1946, Wavell, the then Viceroy, tried an experiment. He virtually converted the Executive Council, of which he was the president himself as the Viceroy ex officio, into a cabinet and invited Nehru to head it and invited Patel to be number 2 as Home Minister. And he then invited Jinnah. Of course, Jinnah was likely not to have agreed, as everybody understood, but he said, then your nominee Lia Cut should be in that grouping. For a long time, there was a huge amount of outrage by Jinnah, and including a rebuff to Lia Cut, that look, how can you expect with Nehru heading it? So we will agree to come only if you make Lia Cut number 2 Home Minister in place of Patel. This is a recorded incident. Gopal Krishna Gandhi has written about it also. Nehru fought and said that you have a choice. You either have the Congress in the Executive Council or forget Nehru and Patel, there will be no Congress at all. We will not join the Executive Council, which is of course unthinkable in 1946. So ultimately, Wavell stuck with Nehru, followed by Patel. I think this is the degree of mutual difference coupled with love and respect, which we just cannot understand in contemporary times. And even to understand that would improve the quality of our body politic, is my personal view. As Rajaji, that great grand man, used to say that Nehru is the man with universal love and Patel is the one who enjoys universal confidence. And I think that kind of combination is what India misses. So as far as this false distortion of history and this creation of a false equation is concerned, I think in the end, as Gopal Krishna Gandhi said, that history, truth's unceasing winnow, ultimately blows all the chaff out. Thank you very much.
Thank you, sir. We'll go next to Mr. Dr. Tathagat Roy for his opening comments.
Can you hear me?
Yes, we can hear you now. Please go ahead.
Right, right. Thank you very much for inviting me to this debate or discussion with such illustrious persons like Dr. Abhishek Manu Singhvi, with whom once before I had the good fortune of sharing a stage in a similar debate on an entirely different subject altogether. That is arbitrations, long time back, if Dr. Singhvi would remember it. Now, but here we are on a very contentious subject. We are on a subject in which the question has been posed whether Nehru was the first idealized politician or the idealist founder of modern India. Now, I have an issue with that choice. First thing, he certainly wasn't the first idolized politician. We see the person whose face we see every time we handle a currency note. That is, Mahatma Gandhi was definitely the most idolized politician. As for the idealist founder of modern India, Dr. Abhishek Singh Manu Singhvi has waxed eloquent about how he could really be worthy of that thing. I have to respectfully join issue with him. Today, we have reached a stage. Over the years, we have reached a stage where we have to undo a lot of things that Pandit Nehru did. We have to undo a lot of things. And among them are the things that Dr. Singhvi has also mentioned, like socialism, left of center position, universal, not universal suffrage, but several other aspects of this thing. Now, let me look at him from my own personal point of view. Maybe he was an idealist. He was quite possibly an idealist. But his idealism did a lot of harm to this country, and the foundation that he laid had to be dug out and undone. Not all that long back in 1991, where we had to undo the edifice of the commanding heights of economy that he had laid down in the 1956 Industrial Policy Resolution. By now, you would have understood that I am no admirer of Nehru. But the damage that he had done, as Mark Antony had said, the damage that people do lives after them. The good that people do lives after them. The damage is oft in the, I'm sorry, got it mixed up. The damage that people do live after them, the good is often interred with their bones. It is somewhat like that. Just imagine, I'm just beginning with a premise. Just imagine India in 1947 and compare it to Germany and Japan. Germany and Japan were in shambles. There wasn't a single building intact. Compare it with South Korea. Even as late as in 1953, South Korea was in shambles. And these countries stood up on their own feet. And eventually, by the 70s, they had entered the First World. And imagine where were we in the 70s? Of course, by 70s, Nehru was no more. But by that time, the edifice or the building that Nehru had built was still standing, and we were still swearing by. So I would begin by a quote from a very celebrated journalist called Durga Das. Many of you have heard of him. Durga Das has been covering the proceedings of the central legislature since the 1920s and the annual sessions of the Indian National Congress and the Muslim League. In his memoirs titled India from Curzon to Nehru and After, he has commented, to Nehru, his image as a democrat and a secular being was of the highest importance. Mind you, his image to himself was of the highest importance. He had no experience of organization. He did not understand economics, nor did he bother to face facts. He wove fantasies around his ideals and believed that somehow his preachings would make people do the things that he wanted. This has also been echoed by a person called Vinay Mukhopadhyay, who saw Nehru at a very close range. Mukhopadhyay is not very well known throughout India, but is quite well known in West Bengal, principally because he wrote mostly in Bengali. And Mukhopadhyay has almost in toto agreed with what Durga Das had said. Now let us count the things that what Dr. Singhvi has said. Factually, there cannot be two opinions about it. But the outcome of it is the main question over here. The outcome and the imprint that it is left on the history of India that followed. Now, let us begin with one of his first acts. He was the person who stopped the Indian army in mid-stride when the army, after a lot of difficulty, was in hot pursuit of the Pakistani tribal irregulars in Jammu and Kashmir. If they had not been stopped, then they could have driven the irregulars, Pakistani irregulars, out of Jammu and Kashmir, and we would have had the whole of Kashmir, not just notionally as we have now, but actually physically in our hand. And more than that, strategically, we would have had the advantage of heights. They could have been driven out into the plains of Punjab. We do not know the reason why he did it. Some say that he had done it on the advice of Mountbatten, Lord and Lady both. Some say that he had done it on the advice of Sheikh Abdullah, because Sheikh Abdullah had influence only in the Vale of Kashmir and not in the outlying parts like what is POK now and Gilgit, Baltistan. These places he did not have any influence, so that he advised Nehru not to go into those. Then the next thing, the Chinese annexation of Tibet. Sardar Patel at different points of time had pointed out that Chinese annexation of Tibet was a very dangerous thing. And even earlier than that, he had pointed out what a danger China could eventually be, which we realize today, which we have been realizing ever since 1962. But did Nehru pay any heed to what Sardar Patel said, or even after Sardar Patel left us, the attitude that Nehru had towards China? Nehru had batted for the inclusion of China in the Security Council, UN Security Council, where at that time China was represented by the Nationalist China, which was a government in exile in Formosa. Now it's called Taiwan. Why did we do it? Why did Nehru do it? It's because of that so-called idealism, so-called dreaming. But did it do his own country any good? The country that he had been chosen to lead, that is India, it did not. It did quite the opposite thing. As a matter of fact, it was quite hotly debated whether India should be given a permanent seat in the UN Security Council. Nehru opined against it and said that no, China should be given. Now, this is a thing on which I would like the rest of the speakers to throw some light, because I simply can't quote an authority, but I have heard it said that India was considered for a permanent seat in the UN Security Council, and Nehru negatived it. Then the next thing, something that Dr. Singhvi has mentioned, the movement of refugees. That is a thing on which I have quite a bit to say. Whenever you talk of the movement of refugees, whenever any All India leader or spokesperson or whoever talks of the All India of the movement of refugees, the thing that comes to your mind are the Punjab refugees. The Punjab refugees, which was the refugee movement, which was a two-way street and which was over by the month of January of 1948. But you completely forget those people completely forget that there was a refugee movement in the East also, which was a very muddled affair compared to the Punjab thing. It was just as bloody, but it was a muddled affair compared to the Punjab thing, and it eventually gave rise to a lot more problems than the Punjab refugees had. And not just that, it is a thing that Nehru, for want of a more precise term, I would say that Nehru botched up completely. What had happened is that unlike in Punjab, in 1947, the flow of refugees did not start from East Pakistan to India. And the people, Hindus, Buddhists, and a few Buddhists and Christians in East Pakistan, they thought that they would be able to stay put there, albeit under Muslim domination. But it didn't happen. The Pakistanis started putting the screws on them, gradually, just as you turn a screw. And by the time it was 1949, beginning of 1949, there was great trouble. The Hindus were put in great trouble. Their businesses were throttled, their properties were throttled. Mind you, Hindus owned a whole lot of businesses and property in East Pakistan. All these were jeopardized, their ownership was jeopardized. And this was brought to the notice of Nehru, and Nehru penned two agreements, which were called inter-dominion agreements, in which it was clearly laid down, both Nehru and Lia Cut Khan, or their counterparts in their foreign ministries, they had clearly laid down that each country would look after its own minorities. Very pious, there's no doubt about it. But after that, what happened? In February 1950, when we were in this country rejoicing over the new republic that we had got, the East Pakistan government, mind you, not the people or not any religious organization, the East Pakistan government launched a horrible pogrom, not a riot, but a pogrom on the Hindus of this country. It will take a lot of time. Excuse me. It will take a lot of time to describe the whole thing. Actually, literature on this particular subject is quite scarce. And if I may venture to say so, there is only one book in English which describes this subject. And that book is written by yours truly. This is the book. This is called My People Uprooted, The Exodus of Hindus from East Pakistan and Bangladesh. Now, the program that I was saying, I can just mention one little thing to prove how government engineered this program was. What had happened is that there is a bridge. It's a very long bridge, about 1 kilometer long, over the river Meghna in East Pakistan. On the 12th of February 1950, all the trains that crossed that bridge, all trains from either direction, they were stopped in mid-span, and all Hindus, their throats were cut and they were thrown into the river. I had heard this from an eyewitness. You may ask me, how come that eyewitness's throat was not cut? Simply because he was wearing a pair of pajamas. The customary dress of Hindus, East Pakistani, East Bengali Hindus in those days, were a shirt and a dhoti. For some reason, he was wearing pajamas, which is why he was mistaken for a Muslim, and he was not killed. Then after that, this program continued, particularly in the district of Barisal. The steamer wharf of the Barisal district, Barisal city, was ran red with Hindu blood. The Dhaka city ran red with Hindu blood. Nehru didn't say anything about it. He just hemmed and hawed and said, yes, this could be done, that could be done. At that time, Sardar Patel had proposed that let us invade East Pakistan and create space for these Hindus. Nehru would have none of it. Sardar Patel was already a sick man by that time. He died in December 1950. But during this period, Nehru did nothing. And to add insult to injury, in the month of April 1950, 2 months after this pogrom had started and it had ebbed a little, he had penned a agreement which was called the Nehru Lia Cut Pact on the 8th of April 1950. Following this agreement, Dr. Shyama Prasad Mukherjee and another Bengali minister, K.C. Nyogi, they both resigned from the Union cabinet. And Dr. Shyama Prasad Mukherjee thereafter founded the Bharatiya Jansangh, which later on metamorphosed itself into the Bharatiya Janata Party, and the rest, of course, is history. But the fact that Nehru had seen, he definitely must have had intelligence inputs of what was going on to Hindus in East Pakistan. He didn't care about it, he didn't give any credence to it, simply because it did not agree with his preset ideas of what should be done. And he definitely would have known that this pogrom in East Pakistan was being engineered by Liaquat Ali himself, Liaquat Ali and his acolytes. But in spite of all this, and after having signed 2 inter-dominion agreements, and thereafter having seen the failure of these agreements, he still went ahead and signed an agreement with Liaquat Ali, a pact with Liaquat Ali. On what basis, none of us know. Now, on the political field, this I think, you could say I'm biased because my ancestors came from East Pakistan. But this, you could say that was one of the worst disservices Nehru did to one set of people of India. Now,
thank you, sir. Thank you for highlighting a very dark.
Am I coming to the end of my time?
And what we'll do is we'll come back to you. We'll bring in also the other speakers, and then we'll come back to you.
Can you give me another 5 minutes?
Yes, sure. Please go ahead, sir.
Nehru imagined himself to be an international arbiter, but in this business with all his predilections for foreign policy, in 1956, he exhibited very bad double standards, which was criticized all over the world in case of Hungary and in case of Suez. Suez was invaded by the British and the French. He dropped down the sky about it. In Hungary, the Soviet tanks invaded that country. He mentioned nothing about it. On the economic scene, he had taxed the nation to its gills and given rise to a parallel black economy. He had given rise to crony capitalism, the license permit Raj, and a kind of a industrial ethos, in respect of which J.R.D. Tata has said that the running of industries is being left to people who have never even run a cycle repair shop in their lives. He had created a Soviet-style semi-Stalinist centralized planning, which he called commanding heights of economy, and which he fancifully called the temples of tomorrow. He created control industries. All these had to be undone in 1991 because we had come to the brink of bankruptcy. He had also failed to address food deficit, governmental corruption, population explosion, illiteracy. I submit that he was not a person to be remembered with fondness. Thank you very much, and I'm sorry if I've overshot my time.
No, sir, thank you. That was very that was very interesting. Very insightful. We'll move on to Dr. Tripurdaman Singh.
Yes, thank you. Thank you very much for inviting me to speak, and it's such a pleasure to speak in the company of Dr. Roy and Dr. Singhvi. And Dr. Singhvi said he's intimidated in the presence of academics, and I would turn that around and say I'm quite intimidated in the presence of such eminent legal and political personalities. So I think we're on an equal footing there. But no, so I'll quickly run through a few things. I mean, I think the question is very interesting. Was Nehru an idealist or was he idolized? And I think there's, of course, an element of truth in both. But one of the things that always happens is that we look at Nehru very, very closely in the realm of ideas, and we don't do that in the realm of practical politics. So we always think of Nehru as this sort of idealist, visionary leader, but he was also a very formidable, politician and tactician. In terms of in terms of what he picked, in terms of how he kind of engaged with his political opponents and colleagues. And so in all of this, I would say that Nehru was not really an idealist. And while he was idolized, it's idolized in the realm of ideas. And I think it's very important that we look at practical politics, as Dr. Roy also mentioned. Objectively, of course, he was a Democrat. He can be credited with laying the foundations of Indian democracy. He ensured free and fair elections, kind of non-violent, clean transfer of power. And so, yes, in purely functional terms, Indian democracy was functional. He was very very committed to it. There were committees. He was, very committed to attending Parliament. People say, he would put all his colleagues, his contemporaries in the wider world to shame by his dedication to Parliament and to democratic procedures. But equally, subjectively, he could afford to do many of these things was because there were hardly any challenges. He had to pay little cost. There was no cost really for all these democratic procedures. And when there was, he could be, very much the authoritarian as well. Which was, again, a criticism that was very widely shared. I'll quickly, again, as Doctors Singhvi and Roy mentioned, run through a few points which had come up in their talks. One, of course, was about Patel-Nehru differences, which were overblown. I don't think they were overblown. To be honest, a catastrophic parting of ways was only averted by Mahatma Gandhi's assassination. In fact, if Gandhi hadn't been assassinated, there was supposed to have been a meeting between the three of them to decide whether Patel or Nehru would stay, because both of them were promising to resign. That's not to say that they actually wanted to resign. This was also, we take this at face value, but this was also political maneuvering for instrumental reasons. And this is something we should never lose sight of. The second point that came up was the Viceroy's Executive Council and the question of Nehru and Lia Cut. The story, and I think it's not just Gopal Krishna Gandhi who says it, a very important resource for this is Wavell's diary itself. And the reason, one of the big clashes was that Lia Cut and the Muslim League refused to recognize Nehru as an interim prime minister. For them, the viceroy was still as chair of the council, and they would not accept Nehru's authority, and that was a huge clash. Equally, one of the mistakes I would say that was made in that setting was that the Muslim League wanted one of the big four ministries, which were finance, external affairs, defense, and home. Sardar Patel didn't want to cede home because it was very powerful and you retain control of the police, etc. They did not want the Muslim League to have control of the armed forces, so they did not want to share defense. That left external affairs and finance. And external affairs was something that Nehru really prized personally, because he had always been interested in international affairs, and he also saw himself as a global statesman. So he retained external affairs because that's what gave him a kind of a stage, really, to kind of to sort of push himself on the global scene. And that's how the Muslim League got the Department of Finance, which, as we know, ended up in disaster because Lia Cut started to block a lot of Congress schemes and tax a lot of industrialists, which hurt especially those who were seen to be backing the Congress, and that led to a complete breakdown of relations. The other was, as Dr. Roy mentioned, India and the UN Security Council. And actually, in light of the Korean War, the Truman administration came up with a proposal to try and floated the idea that they would unseat nationalist China from the UN Security Council, and rather than bring in bring in the People's Republic, offer that seat to India. Now, nothing really came of that because at that point it was still just a proposal. But Nehru did very vehemently push back against it and say that that is not something that we want, and we'll go on advocating for China. And one of the reasons was that Nehru's image as a democrat and a man of peace was, he thought, being undermined by what the Chinese were saying, which was that Nehru was an Anglo-American agent. And that was a criticism that really stung Nehru because his career had been built on anti-colonialism, and he had propagated a doctrine of Asian solidarity, and to kind of disprove really Chinese propaganda. Also at that point, even Soviet propaganda, he kind of bent over backwards to accommodate their concerns, and one of them was pushing for Chinese inclusion into the UN. Again, this is something that's often taken to be a sign of Nehru's idealism, but this was not idealism because Nehru was also very much a man of action and very much a man of the practical political domain. And so these were things that mattered in the realm of practical politics because they affected his image on the global stage, which was very important to him, both in terms of where he positioned India diplomatically and his own kind of towering image that he had in the world, which kind of stood on the twin pillars of anti-colonialism and Asian solidarity. And then lastly, I'll quickly touch on Bengal, and that, as Dr. Roy mentioned, the Bengal tragedy that happened in 1950 is very, very interesting, and it's something that I'm not sure whether Dr. Roy came across my book, but it's something that I do touch upon in my previous book, is that connects very closely to the First Amendment to the Constitution, because what happened in Bengal eventually leads to scathing criticism of Nehru in both in Bengal, within sections of the Congress party, and then sort of widely in the right-leaning press. And it's actually in his attempt to rein in, and it's a curious incident in one of his letters, Patel sort of mentions to Nehru as well that it's a very bad idea. You have an idea of trying to charge Syama Prasad Mukherjee with sedition, and I would not recommend this. So this sort of Bengal tragedy links in to a big current in Indian politics, and it's to clamp down on this sort of criticism that comes from the right, that Nehru thinks is effectively pushing him into taking a foreign policy line the opposite of what he wanted to take. So he wanted peace with Pakistan, both because it connects, in his mind, it connected to communalism in India, but also because his own image as a democrat and a man of peace and a man of sort of internationalism was a key pillar of Indian diplomacy. So that's what, to clamp down on this sort of criticism of his Bengal policy is what one of the it's one of the key reasons that that finally we eventually had the First Amendment to the Constitution. So there are these few things, and I think they're important to remember because every time we kind of debate Nehru, we say, okay, we said, we mention his idealism, but we often kind of forget the pushes and pulls of practical politics. And so if Nehru comes up with, say, a key pillar, as you mentioned, of his vision for India was secularism, and if something comes up short, it's always meant to be, okay, the ideas were great, but somehow the people fell short or the implementation fell short. But a lot of the times that falling short is very much a part of political maneuvering and not simply, somebody being an idealist and people not living up to that idealism. So I think I'll stop there.
Thanks, Dr. Daman. But I don't want you to stop. I want you to just go on one, just address this point, right? So you do say that the values were great, but he did not, well, you're saying it wasn't that he failed to live up to them. The politics didn't allow him to use, or he had his other objectives. And I think where you agree with Dr. Roy is that he cared a lot about his image. It sounds like even more than the interests of the nation. What I want you to address very quickly is these values that you say were at least great, and he voiced these values. Do you think that sort of ties in with what Dr. Singhvi said earlier, that we are one of an exceptional, we are one of the only countries which came out of colonialism and ended up having this stability and democratic traditions? Do you think even though he did not himself implement a lot of the things that he said, but the fact that he said that those things, those values became sacrosanct in Indian discourse, that might have helped strengthen our democracy, which allowed us to survive in this way for subsequent 70 years?
No, well, yes, I wouldn't say that, he just by what he said is, just his words allowed us to survive for 75 years. My point is, yes, many of those words are important, but equally the other point is that his actions are equally important, and there is also a sort of dark side in some ways to Nehruvianism, and that's as much a part of Nehru's legacy, not just the fact that there are this formal structures of democracy, but there are also things such as sedition, things like overbearing kind of power tilting in the favor of the executive, power tilting in the favor of the center. These are very much also part of India's Nehruvian legacy, and we can't ignore them simply by focusing on his words. All of which also we don't take at face value. Dr. Singhvi mentioned the column he wrote where he called himself Chanakya, where he says, Nehru is authoritarian, Nehru is a dictator, etc. And we take it as, someone lampooning himself. But in many ways, Nehru was also being perfectly honest about what he was, because those were also facets of his personality that he recognized. One thing you do have to give him is that he was very forthright and very honest. But he was also a practical politician, and he was interested in accumulating power for himself. He was interested in maintaining his own dominance over the political system, and he was very ruthless about that.
Thank you. We'll move on to Dr. Adil Hussain.
Thank you very much, Yajur. Thank you to all of the panelists who've given very nuanced and insightful pictures of Nehru. So what I will do, for the sake of the ability to have a conversation after this, because if I now give a 10-minute spiel, I do think that we will run out of time. So I'm just going to mention a couple of points that I do think were left out of this conversation, and that would help to move this conversation forward a little bit. And the first one that I want to address is communalism. So the Hindu-Muslim conflict that we've had in the early 20th century in India, and Nehru's view thereof. So for the longest time, and that may be seen as one of Nehru's big misgivings in politics, Nehru sees it as the last emergence of some vested interest that he feels could be prevented by ignoring it for the longest time. So by not engaging with the communal problem, despite the fact that it had already started to materialize on the streets and people had already articulated demands. So Nehru, for the longest time, closes his eyes to this issue, and he is proven wrong by his understanding, at least conceptually, through the partition violence that Dr. Roy mentioned and that Dr. Singh was also addressing, in a sense, because that violence wasn't an elite violence, like it wasn't sort of carried forward by people who were trying to get or who were vying for offices and trying to manipulate the other classes in order to pick up arms, but that it really developed out of people that were now seeing themselves in a way that Nehru didn't think they could. And the second issue that I wanted to raise, and that speaks very much for Nehru, is that despite of his shortcomings that most politicians have had, he was loyal to democratic institutions to the point that he was willing to agree to partition in order to keep the integrity of the Constituent Assembly. So we tend to forget that the cabinet mission plan was, that Nehru either emerges as a villain or as the savior, but that the cabinet mission plan essentially put restraints on the Constituent Assembly on how the makeup should be. And now Nehru's big disagreement with somebody like Jinnah was that should the Constituent Assembly be loyal to those agreements that have happened previously? And Nehru says, no, very vehemently so, because he says that the Constituent Assembly is sovereign. So sovereignty lies within the institution of the Constituent Assembly and not outside somewhere, which was Jinnah's big argument. So we tend to sometimes downplay, particularly with the move forward and then Nehru violating or not violating the constitution himself, we tend to forget that the initial conceptual move that Nehru really makes and for which he's willing to risk and go through partition is a very democratic one. And that is the one that he was willing to say that, okay, the Constituent Assembly is going to be sovereign and the decision that they are going to make are also going to be the decision that will be valid for the Indian people. So that was briefly my comment.
So on that point that you brought up, the cabinet mission, thank you for bringing that up, because that's often comes up in case of the whole partition, right? You're making a case that Gandhi did not agree to the cabinet mission plan because it would not have been very democratic. The way the British had structured the things with, it would not have been the one vote, one person, one vote that we have today. But there is another way to look at this, right? I'll just come to you, Dr. Singhvi, right after. There's just another way to look at it, right? Nehru clearly comes from what Tripur Daman was saying, and before that, what Dr. Roy was saying, clearly liked power. He wanted, and he did have autocratic tendencies. Had he become the leader of a constituent assembly or in the cabinet mission plan, his power would have been a lot less in a federal setup. So can we think of it in another way, that he knew he was going to be the leader of this independent India and he wanted to have the power in the center, and which is what we know he ultimately did. He was an advocate of centralization, central planning, central everything. So I'm just wondering, there's another way. In his book, Maulana Azad, India Wins Freedom, he actually directly blames the intransigence of Nehru and Sardar Patel for partition to happen. He says both of them were so inflexible on the cabinet mission plan that there was no other way around it. So if you just quickly address that, and then we'll go to Dr. Singhvi.
Okay, I'll just make it very brief. You brought up the book of Maulana Azad. Maulana Azad manages to point the finger at everyone and their failures apart from himself. So he emerges as the hero of the book, which is which sometimes tells you about the quality thereof. I don't think that Nehru, he was, power hungry as humans are, right? So that's a human fallacy that, we're striving towards that. But I don't see anything specifically malicious in his actions, because all of the arguments that he's making regarding the cabinet mission plan, he had already made at the time when he wasn't very powerful and where they hadn't benefited him directly, right? So it's only that we can say it in hindsight that we say that, oh, that argument also helped him, but he was articulating the argument well before that he thought that sovereignty should lie within institutions. So I don't think that that is something that can be held in any easy or direct way against Nehru.
Thank you. Dr. Singhvi. So you're on mute.
Since our time is very short, let me do the role of a fan dancer, touching upon points very, very quickly without really covering anything. One, take non-aligned, for example. It is certainly not in the same way that Tito and Nasser and Nehru thought of it, and it should not be. The world is an evolving, dynamic place. But equally, India has to largely remain non-aligned. I'm now, going to be more specific in terms of contemporary times. Your oldest and best friend is Russia. Today, and I'm one for very deep relationships with the US, but today people get lost in the US and the China debate without realizing to what a large degree we have put our Russian equation into dilution, if not tatters. Now that equidistance is the heart of old style NAM, but now to be modified. I think there is merit, therefore, in one of those Nehruvian pillars. Two, Socialism. According to me, for a diverse and a relatively overwhelmingly poor country, socialism is not an ism at all. It is a self-preservatory tactic. Can you ever imagine in India that distributive equity will not be paramount? Only the size of the cake, growth equity will matter, and not how you distribute equity. And that you'll rely on Adam Smith's largely invisible hand to do everything which a market needs to do. Is it imaginable that anything else could have been the creed for India? He was not a communist. He could have implemented virtually communist things. So again, you are doing retrospective wisdom 2020 by hindsight. From 1950 to 65, it was, and it remains subsequent to that also, the basic ethos is not faulty. And of course, the delicious irony is that the most right-wing socialist prime minister is currently ruling. The Pradhan Mantri Yojanas, the Kisan Yojanas, and the re-implementation of the world's largest Manrega social welfare scheme, and time is short, I could give you 10 more. Does that sound like right-wing capitalism or does it sound like socialism? Why? Because you cannot have a government in India which does not go by that ism. Number 3, image, of course. He was in politics, he was a politician, he was in agitation his whole life. If I, me, myself is a bad thing, then the most culpable one would be the person to whom Mr. Tathagata Roy's party pays obeisance. I don't think that's a failing in politics at all. The degrees may matter and range from megalomania to moderation. But certainly, people who are at that level are concerned about their image. And Nehru, if he was not concerned about his image, would be a foolish man, because he had led India, along with Gandhi and many others, in a freedom struggle. The world's second largest population had become independent in 1950. There was a tryst with destiny. How could a person in the middle of that crucible be not conscious of his image? And image consciousness has been taken to a fine art in contemporary times. Number 4, it is very difficult to decide how many refugees in what way to allow in or keep out. It is very difficult to decide when to stop a war. I personally feel that Nehru did commit faults, although not to the same degree as some of his critics, for whom he's the favorite whipping boy. From a 2021 earthquake to a leaf moving in 2020, everything is blamed on Nehru. I do think he made a lot of mistakes, both in China and in Indo-Pak policy. I'm not one of those who are not able to, but there is, from the same quarters, those who admire Mrs. Indira Gandhi to a very high level, but they have no answer for why Indira Gandhi agreed to return POWs. There's a very strong, respectable school of thought why those POWs should have been kept as some kind of a bargaining hostage for longer, or for that matter, the Shimla Agreement. And mind you, a certain viewpoint in a certain dispensation doesn't allow them to criticize Indira Gandhi at all, whereas Nehru remains the favorite whipping boy. So I think you have to see contextually. I don't think Nehru could have invaded China for Tibet. I don't think Nehru could have been in the vanguard. Yes, I agree that he should not have supported China for the Security Council. Mr. Roy himself concedes that there is no proposal, at least in evidence before us. Of course, researchers will educate us later, that India was at the anvil and the threshold or the cusp of becoming a Security Council member. I don't think Nehru has ever suggested anywhere that in place of India, China should get it. But yes, he was a supporter of China getting his place. And that may not have been opportune. I also agree that Nehru overstayed his welcome with China. There was a period people forget, from the 50s to the mid-50s, early 50s to the mid-50s, when India-China relations were not bad at all. And I think Nehru wallowed in that romanticization a little too long and did not smell the coffee after 58. But to suggest that he could have done something more aggressive about Tibet, except to join hands on an international calumny, is wrong. He could hardly cede PMship to the Muslim League or to Jinnah. I don't agree at all that there was any way of avoiding partition, save and except that. And you would have had him as a much more favorite whipping boy had he ceded anything to the Muslim League of that kind. Even for that matter, the Ministry of Finance seeding was a big issue in those days. Why did you seed it? So therefore, and I love that phrase, a legacy of sedition, a sedition legacy. If you link Nehru to sedition legacy, I don't know what degree of adjectives you will use for the current scenario for the last 5 years of the word sedition. Yes, Nehru retained the provision in our IPC, which perhaps he should not have. But let me tell you that there can hardly be a more capacious person in terms of tolerating dissent than Nehru, with all his faults. I don't want to take more time. I think the important thing is that the very fundamentals of democracy remain secure. And till now, I don't think I've heard any direct answer that why is it that India remains this democracy with this combination? Let me for a minute assume that the only other person who could have become Prime Minister is Patel. We have to use the economic phrase ceteris paribus, everything else remaining the same, and Patel becomes Prime Minister. Well, Patel doesn't last after 1950. You would still have Nehru. Was there a better person? So you have to deal with this question. Could there have been another person with a different philosophy who would have made India something else but for Nehru? Because there was nobody else. It was only Nehru. I'm assuming that there's 2 years of prime ministership of Patel. In that case, I think you have to judge Nehru on those parameters. I think it's a fallacious example to even talk of countries like Germany, Japan, and South Korea. I think where we lost 10 years is again we overstayed. You know, the fundamentals of the Indian economy are strong today because of that very phrase, commanding heights. I would support it fully, but I would not support it after 70. Why we are 10 years behind China is from 70 to 80, again, Nehruvian philosophy overstayed its welcome. We should have perhaps started changing it earlier. But to have not had that policy till the late 60s, I would totally disagree. I remember going to Pakistan in the very early years, and from a toaster to a car to everything was imported. India has self-reliance. There will be no Atmanirbhar in 2020 and 21, but for the Nehruvian commanding heights in the 60s. So I think we have to put it in context. Yes, I think parts of his China policy was seriously flawed, and part of his Indo-Pak was also over-romanticized. I would concede that. Thank you.
Thank you, sir. Thank you for a very objective defense. Dr. Roy, do you want to respond?
Sorry, 1 second more. I think,
so let Dr.
1 second more.
Yes, go ahead.
I think there cannot be anything more reprehensible than what happened in 50 or so, or 49 or so in East Bengal, East Pakistan, and Bengal. But I think that is a little unfair to put as a scourge on Nehru. India had become independent. 2 countries were there. Short of invasion, nothing else could have prevented it. I think the original plan to have the 2 enclaves or the 2 minorities in each country was done out of bona fide objectives, because there were large diasporas in each country which could not be so easily displaced. But the fact is that it led to some very cruel actions in Bengal. And I think it is just the result of partition. Equally cruel actions have happened across all the migrations. And I think to Nehru, well, I don't think you can blame Nehru in 50 onwards for inaction when 2 countries had become independent. At the most, he could have been more receiving of these refugees.
But sir, on that very point, I would like to ask you, the earlier point about Sardar Patel becoming the Prime Minister. Usually when people say Sardar Patel should have become the Prime Minister, it is for these critical years from 1947 to 1950. The general view is that Kashmir conflict would not have gone on for 70 years had Patel been in control. And the Bangladesh, where Patel had advocated for annexation and restitution for the refugees.
I am a great admirer of Patel, and possibly I think the resolution in the UN would have been the only difference. I don't agree, with greatest respect, about Patel's proposal to annex West Bengal, East Bengal. I think that is something which might have been a romanticized proposal. It was impracticable. It was not going to be possible, and it would have led to having emerged out of the pogroms already another pogrom would have been in the offing. So I think that part of Patel's suggestion, howsoever terrible the East Pakistan thing was not a solution to annex East Pakistan.
Thank you.
East
I like
Pakistan
Dr. Roy.
East Pakistan ultimately fell because of the Pakistanis themselves, and that is why 71 happened. But a external annexation, I don't think in 50s was a real thing.
Dr. Roy. So you need to unmute first. So you need to unmute yourself. Maybe I can do it for you. Ask to unmute.
Right. Can you hear me now?
Thank you.
Yes. I was about to agree with Dr. Singhvi about what he had last said, about just before last, when he added a little bit saying that invasion of East Pakistan would not have been the right thing, and Pakistan eventually imploded because of their inner contradictions, which it did in 1971. I absolutely don't agree with it, because the reason why it imploded in 1971 and why the pogrom against Hindus had gone on in 1950 with Nehru doing nothing about it, these two have nothing in common. The 1950 pogrom resulted in unidirectional, in one direction, movement of 1.2 crores of Bengali Hindu refugees. This is a very little known fact, because the East Pakistan exodus has not been written about except to a very sparing extent in Bengali. So I do not think Dr. Singhvi is right. I think Sardar Patel was right, and we should have invaded East Pakistan at that time and grabbed a part of the land to rehabilitate the East Pakistan refugees. After that, what had happened to the East Pakistan refugees was unspeakable. They had to be rehabilitated in out-of-the-way places like Dandakaranya, where the terrain was inhospitable, and they came back, and then Marichapi and all that. I don't want to go into that. That is a different chapter altogether. Another point on which I would like to join issue with Dr. Singhvi was about socialism. Of course, this could lead to a very fundamental difference of opinion. But I'd like to say about socialism just one thing, that a sworn enemy of socialism, Margaret Thatcher, said that you cannot enrich the poor by legislating the rich out of their money. The size of the cake has to increase. You can't distribute if you don't have a sufficiently big cake. And the size of the cake could have increased by going for free enterprise instead of the license permit Raj that Nehru had foisted on this country. And the civil servants who he appointed to run industries, which he fancifully called the temples of tomorrow, which had resulted in our near bankruptcy in 1991 and having to undo all that Nehru did in the previous years. As for the other person, other than Mayank, what's his name? He had spoken about Sardar Patel and Maulana Azad. Actually, I have Maulana Azad's book right with me here. And Maulana Azad had bitterly regretted the fact that he had handed over his mantle as the Congress president to Nehru and not to Sardar Patel, because Sardar Patel would never have made the mistake that Nehru did on the 10th of July 1946, when he negatived the Congress's and League's earlier acceptance of the cabinet mission proposal, with the result that the League announced the Great Calcutta killings, and eventually the country was partitioned with such a lot of bloodshed. Now, this is the thing that Maulana Azad has said very clearly. And although Maulana Azad has been run down very badly by Ram Manohar Lohia, who said that there is a lie in every page of that book, I think this is not factually disputed. That Nehru did it only because he wanted to be a powerful prime minister of a partition country rather than a less powerful prime minister of a whole country, which was, I mean, in other words, he would rather choose partition than being a less powerful prime minister of a partition country. As for Dr. Singhvi's submissions about concern for image is all right for a politician. Which politician doesn't have a concern for image? But should concern for image outstrip or outweigh one's concern for one's own country, which he had been chosen to lead? You must remember that he wasn't just the external affairs minister, he was the prime minister. He was the summit man, he was the representative of the country. And in that position, going out and then trying to further the cause of communist China, senseless. And a small factual error that Dr. Singhvi had said, that after 1958, the Nehru did not smell the coffee is not quite correct. Even in 1955 or 1956, China had committed philatelic aggression. In their stamps, postage stamps, they had shown a map of China in which Ladakh, parts of Ladakh, Aksai Chin, and what was Nefa then, now Arunachal Pradesh, were shown in their maps. So it is from quite some time in the past, China had those designs on India, and Nehru simply chose to ignore them because they did not fit in with his preset notions. Thank you very much.
Thank you, sir. Thank you. You want to go next, Tripudaman?
Yes, sure. Just like a few quick interventions. One, again, as Dr. Roy mentioned about China. The thing is that Nehru was, in some ways, of course, he was misled by his own idealism and his own sinophilia, but equally, as his biographer Sarvapalli Gopal notes, Nehru was surrounded by what he called moldering mediocrities. And Nehru, because he was such a powerful figure, people often told him what he wanted to hear. So if you ever see this kind of reports that came to him from China, they more or less often confirmed his own beliefs. And so, a lot of it was his own volition. A lot of it was also him being misled, in a sense, because people assumed that they should give him what he wanted to hear. And if you ever read Ambassador Panikar's reports from China, that is very much the case. Secondly, there was offers of American help to help assist Tibet, and if the Indian government had chosen to support the Tibetan cause, they would very well have been in a position to do so with help from the Western world. But because, again, we did not want to substantiate Sino-Soviet charges of continuing to be under Anglo-American influence, we refused their help, and we were very happy to let Tibet fall to the Chinese in order to prevent us being charged from being the running dogs of imperialism. And that was again something that Nehru was very, very personally. It stung him very personally because of the fact that his career had been built on anti-colonialism. Secondly, there was, and this again is in support of what Dr. Singhvi says, that there was in the early years, yes, of course, a lot of the kind of centralization, as you mentioned, was driven by Nehru, but crucially, there was a lot of consensus behind it. I mean, nobody was, apart from a few individuals, nobody was really not in the favor of centralization. Everybody wanted a strong center. The Constitution prioritized the unity of the state. It prioritizes the unity of the state over any sort of liberty for the individual or autonomy for the provinces. And it's interesting that Dr. Roy spoke about the cabinet mission plan. And this is interesting because accepting the cabinet mission plan would have meant accepting a large degree of provincial autonomy, something that both ends of the ideological spectrum in India, for some reason, did not want. For different reasons, the right prized the unity of the state off for its own sake. The left prized it as a method of unleashing sort of social change, because neither Nehru nor Ambedkar nor many of the others believed in any sort of organic capacity of Indian society to reform itself. So for them, the only way this was possible, whether it was land reform, whether it was affirmative action, was with a strong state. And so the price of this sort of vision, so the price of socialism is not just in sort of economic terms. One of the prices we paid was that this desire for a strong state, which it led to the Congress agreeing to partition, because for them, this was something that was more important than sharing power. And looping back to what Dr. Roy says, if we had accepted the cabinet mission plan, we would be accepting provincial autonomy, something that is again anathema to both sort of poles on the ideological spectrum in India. And then lastly, there's always a kind of gap between the moral rhetoric that politicians and states deploy and the sort of vagaries of practical politics. And this is very much so in Nehru's terms. And it's not something that we can necessarily hold against him, but certainly the moral rhetoric that he deployed did in many cases boomerang on his own position as sort of ipso facto after his passing. It's easy to deploy that moral rhetoric against him, but that's not something that we can blame on the present. It's only to be expected.
Tripudaman, you talked about the Tibet, which was very interesting for me. It's the first time I hear about this, that their Western help was extended to India to defend Tibet.
The offer was there. The offer very much was there.
I understood. And your point is that he cared about his image. He did not want to look like a Western stooge, especially in the Soviet and other Asian circles. But what about the time? What about the circumstances? If I understand, India had just got independent with these insurmountable problems when they're trying to unite, get Hyderabad in, and all sorts of issues. Do you think in that time, had he not been so concerned about the image, do you think he would have the ability, the bandwidth, and the resources to take on another major war when we had just trying to get our feet on the ground?
I mean, this is again conjecture. When we go into counterfactuals, this is what happens, because events, as we say, everything's non-linear. It's very difficult to say if we changed one variable, how many other things might have changed. India was not in a position to go to war. Everybody, from the generals to Girja Shankar Bajpai and the mandarins of the foreign ministry, agreed that India was not in a position to go to war. But that does not mean that India was not in a position to thwart Chinese designs in Tibet, which was very much possible. They could not have done it without Western help. And it's something that, because India was playing an oversized part in global affairs, and the oversized part it played was, for one reason, down to sort of Nehru's own kind of, image in the world as and the normative power both of his image as sort of India's first free India's first prime minister, and the normative power of India being a post-colonial democracy. And so to maintain that normative power, I mean, both things were intertwined. So as Shashi Tharoor writes in his book, in many ways, Nehru was India and India was Nehru. And when it came to diplomacy, and to continue to, it had neither the economic means nor the military means to really play that role. That role was being played purely on respect and sort of this normative power alone. And the only way they could have played it was to continue to jealously guard that normative power. And it was coming under threat from Sino-Soviet charges that actually India was not free and democratic. Within India, the Communist Party said, "Ye azadi jhuti hai," meaning for them, this was no freedom at all. And from outside, there was charges from the Chinese and the Soviets that India was still under the influence of Britain and America. So it's a balance of events. They could have, if they had chosen to not try and play, which again Patel and others also said, there's no reason for us to play this oversized global role and isolate our own selves. But famously, Ambedkar's resignation statement from government He says, we're plowing a lonely furrow. Nobody cares about us. We have no friends. And one of the reasons that was to try and do this delicate balancing act, of which Tibet was a casualty.
Thanks. I just wanted to bring it up because a lot of times we kind of like look at the current geopolitical situation, and it's nice to think about like, why didn't India do this? Why didn't India take over Balochistan? Why didn't India do this? But it's very difficult for us to kind of like take into account all the circumstances that were there, the kind of resources we had there, and the priorities that Indian leaders had at the time. But you did mention one more thing, that Nehru, nobody wanted to accept the cabinet mission plan. So it was inevitable that it would get rejected. But Jinnah had accepted the cabinet mission plan, and so the Muslim League had accepted it, and Congress had also accepted it. It was later on specific technical points that Nehru went ahead and vehemently opposed it. Is it not correct?
Everybody accepted it. Nobody really wanted it. Like, that's the real position, is that everyone accepted it, but no one really wanted it. And it's interesting because Nehru kind of torpedoed it. But Nehru's views were not actually that different from the sort of views that Azad himself held, that Jinnah himself held. Everybody wanted, we discount the fact that everybody wanted power, and nobody was, this sort of delicate balancing act that the cabinet mission plan did was something that required everyone to compromise. And compromise was something that by that point, nobody really wanted to do. It was the sheer force of will of somebody like Wavell that had kind of brought it to that point. And Wavell, if you ever read Wavell's own diaries, you notice he constantly says, it's impossible to get these people to compromise, talk to themselves. I'm exhausted. He goes on in that vein. So the cabinet mission plan was something that everyone agreed to, but nobody really wanted. And I think Adil might be able to add something to that. So
he's not blameless. He's not blameless in the partition happening. There were others also responsible.
But he was very much one of the architects of it. But my point is that he kind of just shot the first bullet, but everybody else was just waiting for something like that to happen in a way.
Got you. Thank you. So I know we are over time, but I really want to get Adil's views on this because the whole dynamics between Nehru and Jinnah, is an expert on that. So we'd love to hear you, Adil.
I mean, I do think that Dr. Singh just summarized it really well. And the only thing that I may want to add is that Nehru stayed true to his principles during the negotiations in the cabinet mission plan. So despite the fact of him, being portrayed as this power-hungry, greedy politician, I do feel that he comes out of the entire story not untarnished, but very much sticking to his principles. And maybe one last word on Azad. Breaking with the cabinet mission plan was also in line of much of Azad's thinking. So the comments that he then makes in his book come as a bit of a surprise, but that's possibly the concluding sort of statement that I want to make.
So while we have you, can you also give a word on the Nehru Lia Cut plan, which was earlier discussed in detail by Dr. Roy? The Nehru Lia Cut Pact, sorry, not the plan.
Yeah, and I want to maybe mention a book that has recently been written on this called Animosity at Bay with Oxford University Press by Pallavi Raghavan, who's teaching over at Ashoka University, who's shown that there was a clear pattern of working together that was taking place on both sides, so India and Pakistan. So despite the fact that we sometimes see partition as this big rupture that didn't allow them to sort of communicate any longer, there were also clear signs of both countries reaching out to each other and trying to sort out administrative issues. And the Liaquat, Ali Khan and Nehru Pact is like one accumulation of that sort of deep-seated ideology that drove the countries in the first few years of their existence.
Thank you. I think we got to conclude here. So it was a pleasure to have all of you. I could just go on listening to all these experts, and so much of knowledge, but we are way out over time, so we have to conclude here. This has been a fascinating conversation. Thank you, all of you, for your time. It's been a great pleasure. Thank you. We look forward to having you on our platform in the future.